Morning.
Good morning.
Morning. Looks like I need some sort of approval to turn on video.
You should have approval now.
There we go. All right, 5 minutes, one panelist.
And David, you might want to change your name, but I think right now it says James.
That is pretty odd.
Yeah, I think if they use someone else's link, maybe if that would happen. But I was worried if people like forward their links to each other, then yeah.
Gotcha. It's like thinking my brother's name is James. Did he use my Zoom on my computer? I've logged on with the name of my wife because I've used her iPad for Calico meetings. Like, who's Stephanie? All right.
And maybe just around 9 o'clock, I can say like a word to introduce you, David, and then you can introduce the panelists and start.
Sure, sounds good. I think I'll have to mostly let them introduce themselves.
That's also perfectly good.
I know Ziv. A lot of great talks yesterday.
Yeah, it was really good.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, and I feel like student talks are getting better and better every year.
Yeah, people are becoming much more polished, especially with the spotlights, the 5-minute short talks.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I saw there were lots of nice discussions at the poster session too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at some point there was about 100 people at the poster session, which was a really nice turnout.
Wow. Nice.
James, what was the trick for YouTube? Somewhere.
Yeah, so I've been trying to request permission for YouTube. I think they have to do some internal review to get people, to allow people to live stream. And then finally, I think as of last night, they finally give me permission to live stream.
Interesting. Yeah, I asked David yesterday and he said he could only do it if he used his Gmail account and not his like institution's email account.
So maybe he has live streamed before from his Gmail, so he already have approval.
Maybe.
Hi.
Hi, Ziv.
Morning.
Good morning.
I'm in Paris. It's almost night, but great. Yeah.
Thank you for joining us.
Same, right?
Good day.
That's actually our headquarters. So, talking of industry, sometimes you need to meet with your CEO at his place. And for us, it's Paris, which is fine.
Yep.
How often do you go to Paris?
Hard to know, right? That's my 3rd time this year, but who knows? Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of operations in Europe, much less in the US, so I get to. But that's the advantage of being on the East Coast, right? If I was in Stanford like you, I probably would have had a harder time visiting Europe. So Boston is the closest place to Europe you can be, right? So that's a good place to be. I wonder what Aviv is doing, honestly. I mean, Rick is here. I don't know. I mean, because they have their headquarters is in Basel. And from San Francisco to there, it's actually pretty tough.
So, we're still down one panelist.
Yes, well, we can start just in just a minute now.
Yeah, I think the full panel is here.
Okay, everybody's here.
Oh, great.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think we can get started then. Let me record. Hey everyone, welcome to day 2 of MLCB conference. We had a really exciting first day of talks, and we also have a really packed schedule of exciting talks and discussions the second day. So we'll start with a panel discussion, especially focused around the industry experiences, and then followed by 2 great keynotes and with several really exciting presentations. And then we'll conclude with another poster session. So similar to yesterday, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function on Zoom to input your questions. And with that, we'll start with the panel discussion. So the panel will be moderated by David Kelly. So David has done a lot of great work especially in deep learning for regulatory genomics. So he has extensive experience in both industry and academia. Right? So he's now a principal investigator at Calico Labs. And before that, he did his postdoc at Harvard and his PhD at University of Maryland. So I'll turn it over to David. Thank you for moderating this panel, and he will start by introducing the panelists.
Yeah, great. Thank you, James. So the session today, the goal is to give you all in the audience some idea of what research in this field looks like in industry. Everybody, as they come up through their training, gets the academic perspective automatically through the universities. And I think, there's a lot of really interesting work these days that goes on in industry as well. And there's a lot of industry roles that are not so different from academia and have lots of interaction with academia. So I think our goal here is to expose that world to you all a little bit more. So let's start by just going through each of our panelists. We'll have each of you introduce yourselves. I'll briefly start since James already said a little bit about me. So yeah, introduce yourselves and also specifically say a little bit about what led you to your current position in industry. For me, as James said, I did a postdoc at Harvard in a stem cell lab doing computational biology, and really did a wide search, both universities and industry roles, and was really lucky to find an industry research role that was well aligned with where my research interests were, and also was really trying to develop the type of culture that I believed in, that I believed would make for a really successful organization, which is an emphasis on doing basic research, acknowledging that research is hard and sometimes it doesn't work and you still have to take on those high risk, high reward projects, but trying to acknowledge that you can do a really great job on a project and have it not work. And if people are paying attention, they'll really see that, okay, the work was solid, the result wasn't what we wanted, but we still believe that this is worth committing to. So for me, that company is Calico Life Sciences, where I lead a small research group now that's interested in the role of gene regulation in aging, and specifically really these days focused on being able to predict the effect of genetic variants and connect with human GWAS so that we can better understand these diseases and hopefully find new targets. Okay, let's roll around the panelists. I'll pass it next to Ziv.
Great, thank you, David, and thanks, James, and I don't know who else for organizing this. I think this is something that would have been extremely useful for me before I joined Sanofi. So Ziv Bar Joseph, I was for 19 years a professor at the School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon University, involved with two departments, machine learning and computational biology. And I joined Sanofi, which is a French pharmaceutical company with major research sites in Cambridge and in Paris. I joined Sanofi 9 months ago. And that's actually the reasons that I joined Sanofi. First of all, I mean, I'm going to say a bit, but if you have time, go to my LinkedIn page. I published a few blogs or very detailed descriptions about why I joined Sanofi and a little bit about the challenges that I have been facing since joining. So if you have time, go there. But if you don't, the reason why I joined Sanofi had a lot to do with COVID. So I was actually, I must admit, I was very happy with my position at CMU. I got to work with amazing people, really, like I couldn't ask for better students, better postdocs. And unfortunately, not because they wanted my mentoring, just because CMU. So I got to pick from the best who came to CMU, which was great. I also was doing okay in terms of publication, so they didn't kick me out, and reasonably well in terms of funding. But then COVID happened, and I was amazed by the importance that the drug company played in getting us out. So you can argue, but I thought that Pfizer and Moderna really, really saved the day. And I started asking myself, of the work that we are doing, and again, I'm not questioning the importance of the work that academia is doing. I think it was great. But I wanted to understand how much of it is really translated into products. Like, how is it affecting the drugs? How did it affect COVID? And can I play a part in developing these products? I wanted to be closer to the actual product. So that's fortunately, at the same time, Sanofi was looking for someone to lead their machine learning AI operations. So I joined 9 months ago. I don't know but I'll say a few words about what I'm doing. So I'm leading there a department. I mean, at least in academia, it's like a department. We have a few teams that work on developing large-scale machine learning. They like to call it AI, but it's really machine learning products that cover the entire range of drug discovery operations, from something called target identification, maybe we'll go more, to drug design, to clinical. Now we are not the only ones, there's other teams, but we cover the entire space. And if there's time, I can talk more about each of them.
Great, thanks. All right, next let's go to Sophia. I think we've got a mute there.
Yes. So can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm a data science manager at Recursion, Sophia Çelik. I actually started Recursion about 2 years ago now. And before that, I was working for Benevolent AI, another biotech company, which is working on knowledge graph-based link prediction to identify new targets and do precision medicine for different diseases. So yeah, this was right after my completion of PhD at the University of Washington, computer science. And now at Recursion, what excites me the most is the in-house data that we generate, the scale of it, and all the great work that we can do for actual drug discovery using like millions of experiments, billion, like 1 billion, more than 1 billion images at this point. So this is really why I joined Recursion. I was happy at Benevolent AI as well, but both are really like medium scale biotech companies where you can work in a very fast-paced environment, like in close collaboration with great researchers to actually do impactful work for drug discovery. So this is what attracted me to industry. So before that, actually a long time ago, I also worked, like before doing PhD, I also worked for a few years in industry. So I didn't know what it looked like. And it wasn't super hard for me to make the decision after PhD to go into industry. And I really appreciate all the, all the great work and the papers published by academics, and I did that myself too. Maybe the main reason what I was not super excited about was the, grant writing process and all the pressure that comes from it in academia. And when I started PhD, since I had this industry experience already, my plan was to stay in academia after finishing. And after seeing all the, financial pressure that comes with it, and not always being able to focus on actual research as a PI, and long review processes for the papers was what maybe made me change my mind. And yeah, I now am managing a team here at Recursion. We are actually building maps for biology using phenomics data coming from CRISPR perturbations and small molecule compound perturbations. And yeah, that's really exciting. And yeah, I can tell more about that later, but this is my story.
Great. All right. And Richard, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, so I guess like Zib, I was very happy in academia for a while. I was at Courant in the CS department and at the Simons Foundation and at NYU for 17 years. I got the little 15 years, they gave you like a little piece of plastic that says 15 on it. It's purple. It's really a wonderful gift. But for me, the reason for founding Prescient with Kyung-Young Cho and Vlad Grigorovich, and the reason for jumping to Genentech and really going 100% industry was just excitement over the topic. So I don't know if I have any sort of teachable or transferable thoughts on why I went to industry, but I can say that there's lots of different frustrations in both places. There's grant writing in academia, and there's the board or leadership, moving your cheese suddenly in industry. And I've been having a lot of fun with Genentech, partly because at Genentech there's been a big move towards computation. There's been a lot of support on the leadership team, and so I guess for me, this was an opportunity to build something and to scale some of our ideas at the interface of design, structure, and active learning. And it was just a case where a lot of the things that were holding back the research were engineering and scale related, and not necessarily, those were things that were holding the research back in addition to all the intellectual challenges. So this was a way to solve some of those, cut through some of that red tape and make some progress. And so for me, it was all about an opportunity to build something. And I'll pass the mic back to you at that.
That's I think a great perspective, one I share. Okay, so I have a list of questions here. I'm going to work through them. If anyone in the audience has particular questions they want to ask, feel free to start writing those down and we'll collect them at the end. But I'll reverse the order here and send it right back to you, Richard. Thus far, what has been the thing that surprised you most about working in industry versus academia?
Well, one of the things that surprised me initially was just, you don't always get your way. You don't always get the head count you want. You don't always get the corner office, but you find out very quickly, or you can if you're good at sort of nurturing the right relationships with whatever leadership you report up into, or whatever board you interact with. And so for me, I was surprised by how quickly I got no's and how quickly I got yeses, even though I think I got them in roughly the same ratio. And so what that made me, one thing that really did for me was make me feel like I could move a lot faster on some of the issues. And I guess then the other thing that surprised me was just that the way in which we train and educate in industry is definitely has actually a lot more similarities than I expected. And that, to what degree that's a general conclusion versus a Genentech conclusion, because we do joke that Genentech is Genentech University. But I was surprised by how many things we did that actually were pretty similar in structure to how we did things in academia for training purposes. So that was actually kind of a big surprise as well. Pleasant surprise.
Give an example of that.
Well, the postdoctoral program has got a lot of the same recent adaptations to make the cohort more unified, to make sure that mentors have some reporting up to their managers, which again doesn't, there's not a lot of negative feedback that goes back and forth through those channels, but just knowing that you have to be organized in certain ways just makes you a more caring, more thoughtful manager or mentor. All the structures around journal clubs and the mechanism by which you publish or don't, a lot of those sorts of things are the same. Now, of course, all the activities that feed directly into drug discovery, which are 60%, those are not the same. Those don't have a great analog in academia. So it's really, I'm talking about the subset of time that we get to devote to basic science. That part has a similar structure. The rest of it's totally wildly different. Yeah.
Nice. Okay, Sophia, what about you?
I didn't have a lot of surprises, honestly. Maybe this is because, I started in industry and then went to academia and then again into industry, but maybe a very interesting difference is as a computational researcher in industry, you definitely need skills to have scalable and efficient code. So you really, it's hard to avoid that. And, you have to work typically with much bigger data, and also you are working in big teams and you are held accountable for the quality of the code that you write. And you also typically work for an internal or external product that requires reproducible code. So we need to do some engineering as well, besides the actual science and research. I'm really glad though that recently top-tier journals started to push more for reproducible code that needs to be published with the paper. And I think this is really great to see because, this actually drives higher quality and reproducible code for academia as well. But I think this, this may be one big difference that I have seen, and maybe it's a good surprise to some extent as well.
And Ziv, what about your year here?
So unlike the other two, I was really surprised by a lot of things, I must say. So the first surprise, and that's something that I was really worried about before I came, is how much science there is actually for computational biology. And before I came, of course, people who interviewed me for Sanofi told me, look, this will be exciting, but that's what they will tell you. So I called Rich's boss, Aviv, and asked her, what does she think? Is there really a science? She didn't know Sanofi, and I called your former boss, David, I don't know if you were there, but Daphne, and asked her the same thing. And I called Seraphine, and they all, was a previous one, and they all promised me that don't worry, you will have enough science problems to work on when you're there. And they were right. I mean, so I was surprised, first of all, by the answer, and the fact that they were right was also surprising. So there's a lot of interesting scientific challenges. Of course, there's other things, as Rich was saying. I mean, there's other issues, but so that was surprising. The second surprise was that people are very interested and eager, I would say, to use machine learning. So people in the R&D, so R&D, research and development, is a large part of the pharma organization. It's not the big, I mean, we're talking 10, 20%. We have sales, but people in R&D are sold on the importance of machine learning, and they actually are looking and waiting for us to help them. So that was very good. Yeah, I mean, I was surprised by how much, and as I said, I mean, I was in Pittsburgh. Maybe that's a difference between me and some of the other people. In Pittsburgh, we were very isolated from industry. I didn't realize how much of the things we actually did in my group in our program were very relevant to pharma. I'm really excited about some of the things we are doing. And on the negative side, the thing that surprises the most is that hiring is a challenge. I never had a problem with hiring. People came to CMU, I would just ask them to join my group. Some would, some wouldn't, but I would always have people. So we had, I mean, it wasn't a huge team. Now I'm trying to build a bigger team. We're talking 40, 50 people, and I find hiring to be extremely challenging. And we are hiring all over the world, and it's still a big challenge. But other than that, the surprises were pretty good.
Good. Okay, I'm gonna build off that question. So there's a lot of enthusiasm for computational analysis and machine learning. What would you say are the biggest obstacles or bottlenecks to achieving your mission at your company? You know, maybe it's in that space, maybe it's something more broadly. And then also, you know, what would you encourage out to the audience to, what types of problems should people be working on in academia to help overcome them?
You want to start with me?
Yeah, go ahead.
So the biggest challenge I see at my company is the data is a mess. I mean, it's a mess. It's very hard. The data is not amazingly well organized. I think we need to put the foundations before we build the AI. And we're working on it. And some areas are much better than others. For example, any clinical data is highly regulated, so it's better, but other data are not. So that's definitely a challenge and makes our life harder to find where the data is. And there's also other issues related to, as Rich was saying, headcounts, how do you divide the work? In fact, I think some of the things we need to get used to is to say, no, we can't work on this. This is not a priority. This is something that I can't do. I don't have, so that's actually something that I wasn't used to doing, right? But now, I have to do. Now, in terms of what people in academia can do, you know, we collaborate actually quite a lot with people in academia. I think the whole notion of pharma company is the idea that we cannot do most of the things on our own. We are more than open to buy or collaborate on a lot of the things because we are not, right? We are not doing all the, so if there is a specific issue, for example, that we're very interested in, we would be more than happy to collaborate. I'm just, as an example, we're working on some spatial transcriptomics product or analysis, and we're using some visualization, cell visualization that was created by university, and we are contacting them to actually say, let's work together, we will pay some money, but let's work with you. So again, I don't know if there is a way to think in advance that what you would do would be of interest to specific people, but if it is, we will call you. We are more than happy to use and work with others because we don't want to, or we don't think we can do everything alone.
Yeah, agree with that. Sophia, what about you? What are the big problems at Recursion?
Yeah, so it is, Recursion generates most of its data, right? But we don't always have like the chance and time to, develop great models and, build the state of the art to explore the hidden, all the great information that's hidden in this data. So we continuously strive for better models and benchmarks, but we really want to work with academia to achieve that. We know that there is a lot of great work in academia, some of which unfortunately just end up staying in papers, but we try to be stay current with what's being done, and we try to use those methods or data as much as we can and are aware of. Maybe one example that was a great collaboration with the community as a whole was there was a Kaggle competition kicked off by Recursion a few years ago. It was for cellular image classification. And actually the winning model there was a great starting point for Recursion to develop its own current proprietary neural network to classify images. And we could have those kind of community challenges in the future as well. And I really appreciate if people, all the great minds around the world in academia as well, participate and help us, use our data in the best ways possible for drug discovery.
Great. And Richard?
Yeah, I just agree with the panelists before. Now, so I agree with Ziv that informatics and moving the data can be a huge challenge. There's a real diversity of different assays and data types that actually are important for developing a drug, whatever modality you're using, and that creates a lot of challenges that are substantive. Even if we put a lot of effort into it and do it right, it's still going to be hard. So I agree with that. Another thing, that's interesting is, I feel like in academia and in industry, we might not be entirely appreciating how fast the field's moving, and we might not be thinking through to where we're, what we're going to actually do when some of this stuff works. So one example is just like the traditional barriers between large and small molecule drug discovery. There are different units, different teams, there's different ways of thinking about things. And it's largely because most of the way we got those drugs were empirical screens for affinity, followed by a lot of trial and error. Well, if we actually can de novo design affinity, and then we have all kinds of ways of conditioning for properties while we're generating, well, that basically means that the teams that work on small molecule and large molecule computational drug discovery are going to come a lot closer together. And, I think in academia, people are actually a lot better prepared for that maybe than in industry, or at least I see a lot of papers where there are graph generation or active learning questions, and you see a diversity of examples. And then, when you look at how we organize things in industry, there might be some institutional changes that need to happen to accommodate for things maybe working a lot better than we thought they would 5 years ago. So I think that's one sort of challenge, is that as these technologies start to work and become more powerful, they rearrange how we should sort people into working groups. And then that's problematic because headcount is a valuable thing in industry, just like moving people in, between labs is a dangerous thing in academia. As far as what people could work on in academia, I think this is really extraordinarily close to what I'm thinking about these days. But I do think that active learning and experimental design and ways of actually taking a machine learning method that works and combining it with other things that work to varying degrees, how do we make decisions in that space? A lot of the methods for generative approaches to small molecules and large molecules, a lot of the ways in which we look at genomics data and spatial data these days, there are things that can generate hypotheses by the millions. And so you can't just cherry pick the best point estimate. You have to think about ways of spreading out which samples you get excited about, which models you get excited about, if you have some hope of improving the model and maybe exploiting the model. So I think actually, if I got to say what the next greatest thing is take some of these really amazing generative models and start to get quantitative about error and start thinking about how to embed them in a proper active learning or experimental design framework. But again, that's just what I want. That's on my list. So, it's a little bit biased there.
Well, your bias is the reason you're here to tell us all what to be interested in. I'll quickly add one for Calco. The company's interested in aging, and just about every aspect of biology has a paper about how it changes with age. That's how I feel. It's not a statement of fact necessarily. So I think one thing that would really help me sift through all of that information is more work on causal modeling. I myself have written lots of deep neural networky models that have no real basis of causal interactions within them. But I'm really excited to see that the field is beginning to move in that direction to build models that are more interpretable and that are thinking hard about causal interactions, which ultimately, if you want to intervene to try to alleviate a disease, you really want to make sure that you have all that worked out right. Okay, let's pivot a little there. from there, from the science to some more about the experience working in industry. So one thing I've noticed is coming up through grad school, through postdoc, the main incentive in front of me was to write great papers and, have them influence the field. And I still find that that is a very useful thing to try to do in industry. But I also see people at my company and at others who are really successful with a more diverse set of approaches. So I wonder what you panelists have seen in your companies. What other forms can success take? For someone who came through grad school, postdoc, and they like doing the science, but 30 supplementary figure papers and the navigating peer review is not their favorite part of the process. What sorts of ways can they contribute in your companies? And let's start this time with Sophia.
I was muted again. So yeah, there's really, more incentives than writing papers or grants in industry. So one of the most important things is really whatever we do at Recursion, at least specifically like my experience at Recursion, what we do needs to have an impact and a measurable improvement in how well we can discover drugs, right? So we cannot really do something just for maybe improving a particular method 1% in recall. So this is really something that has been clearly agreed on with all the stakeholders. Like a method could be very interesting, but if it doesn't have a real impact in our predefined metrics agreed with stakeholders, our internal users, and our pharma partners, then really there is not a lot of ways that we can work on this, right? So actually this was a big motivation for me to move into industry in the first place, because I know that what I do will be used in some way. It may not end up leading to a drug in clinic necessarily, but at least it will help one or more processes of discovering drugs. And this is the part, maybe this is the biggest incentive in academia, in industry compared to academia. We still write papers, but we are not necessarily spending months for, sometimes doing things just to, make reviewers happy. Unfortunately, this happens a lot in academia. Maybe not to improve the quality of the paper, but sometimes you have to do some experiments just because a reviewer asked for it. So of course, like there are other cons in industry, such as you may be very excited about a particular paper, but you may not really have the chance during your work hours to actually try that out. But at least, knowing that what I do is gonna impact the predefined metrics and eventually the drug discovery is really a big incentive for me.
Great. Ziv, what about you?
Yeah, so first of all, I want to say that don't discount papers. So I know that we're very, and you so Genentech is definitely, encouraging papers, Calico even more, and Sanofi as well. We are encouraged to write papers. I can give people in my group time to write paper. I am actually judged based on the number of papers that we publish. So papers are important for us. It's not, if you come to work in Sanofi, you will be expected to write papers. But I have to say there's a lot of other things that I agree that in academia we don't have. The first thing is that we cannot work, at least for us, or it's very unusual to work on a problem that the business doesn't support. And when we say business, we mean the experimental folks. So we need to identify problems that they are interested in. It doesn't mean that they understand or they buy completely into. For example, Rick mentioned active learning, which is a great idea, right? And maybe people are not into it because they don't know. So we are working with a number of different groups on active learning, but they had to agree to work with us on this. Otherwise, we cannot start a project in the company. We need to say what is the expected outcome to the business before we start a project. You cannot work on some great idea, which is very vague in terms of the specific outcome that it will have on the drug discovery process. That doesn't mean that tomorrow you'll have a drug, right? If we work on spatial transcriptomics, it's not like we can identify immediately a cancer drug, but the advantage for immunotherapy is clear. So you need to define that, and you need to find people to work with. The other thing, so that's different, and your contributions are not just measured by paper, but also on the impact you have on the process of drug discovery that is very general. For example, if we save the company some money by doing less experiments with the same model, for example, using active learning, that's a great outcome. We don't need a paper. Of course, if we can publish a paper, that'd be good, but that's definitely a quantifiable thing. I would say in industry, you work usually in larger teams than in academia, at least my experience. In academia, I had students, they all worked almost exclusively with me or maybe in a group with someone else. In industry, the groups are bigger, at least in our teams, they're bigger. So you are a contributor to a larger a goal. Usually the scale, as was mentioned, are bigger because the goal is that it doesn't just work for some demo or proof of concept for a paper. We really want this to work for the entire company. And you're being judged also on the scalability of what you're building, which is very unusual for someone who writes papers, right? Write a paper, we develop it, someone else can work on it. So those are, I think, a few things that are different. But as I said, there's a lot of similarities. Papers, patents are definitely things that we have encountered.
Yep. I think that's excellent. So then could I infer from that there are roles to maybe help people scale their projects, that is someone that a trainee could imagine coming into your company and doing and focusing on, like, how do I take like nuggets of ideas that work well and make them bigger?
So how do you, right, that's actually a good question. So we don't scale everything. You need to prove that what you want to scale is really needed by a lot of different teams. If this is something that will support 1 or 2 projects, we're not scaling. So that's a big decision, because if we decide to scale, I'm putting 6-10 people on this for, I don't know, 6 months. This is a lot of money and a lot of, so most of the things we are doing, and there are people who are doing small things. I'm not saying it's not important for a specific project. If you want to run a clustering algorithm or you want to run some classifier or some, we are doing that. But if you want to take an idea and scale it, you need to convince some people, including myself, that this is something that is worthwhile. Yes, and in some cases we do it, some cases we say no.
Great.
Yeah.
Richard?
Well, yeah, I mean, for me, I think one sort of dimension to add here is that in addition to the roles, you also have to kind of think about where you are in your career stage, right? And so if you're young, if you're earlier in your career stage, or you've more recently switched, your field of view or your topic, then visibility is more interesting and important. So the degree to which papers are important for us at Genentech sounds like it's similar to what Ziv is experiencing. It is part of how we're evaluated. In terms of scaling, what I've found is that we work in bigger teams, and the role of group leaders and the role of project managers is actually not entirely different from how you would manage things in academia if you were in a larger consortium. But I do think you get some better support, and there are some sub roles there. The other thing that's really interesting is the way in which collaboration can be approached. Yeah, I feel like you have more diversity, and there are people to support those different types of collaboration, whether they're academic partnerships, whether they're cross-unit collaborations, or whether they're partnerships or deals with other companies. And so there are actually roles for facilitating those other kinds of collaborations. We've had a lot of interactions with the partnering team at Roche and Genentech, and they're basically scientists who look to find ways in which they can accelerate science by finding really, cross-company collaborations, which you might consider, the most extreme type of collaboration where you actually get to put things together across very different units. So I think those partnering roles and some of the business roles, sometimes they can evolve somewhat naturally from a science role. And I've seen a lot of people transition in those ways, even in just the short year and a half I've been there. So I think that's actually a pretty interesting difference between academia, is that there are actually a broader range of project management and business roles, and many of them are actually more science weighted if they're in the sort of partnering and collaboration side of things. The other thing that I've found is that, a lot of the really deep business side of things, the IP side and some of the strategy side, again, those roles, there's a much deeper connection between those roles and the science roles than you would see. There's really not quite any analog to that in academia. And I think that it takes the act of being a project leader or project manager, it makes it somewhat more interesting, at least for me, to not have that be, the allocations of funding, the allocations of resources, instead of it being a black box, it being a sort of active discussion about scientific and drug discovery objectives. I mean, to me, that's a lot more interesting than, sort of how we at the larger scale allocate resources in academia for research. So that's been fun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I'm looking through the Q&A here, and I'm seeing a lot of great questions. So I think we should jump right in there. I'm going to try to cluster a few of these questions together. There's a few people who I'm going to guess are in the middle of their training and sounds like we've piqued their interest, and they might want to jump into an industry research position. And they're curious about what sorts of topics in their PhDs and postdocs would be best to cover. Is there stuff they should stay away from because it's less good for industry? Is there stuff they should lean into because it would be better? If you're a PhD, should you do an industry postdoc? Should you just go get a job? Should you do a postdoc in academia? Kind of broadly, what sorts of comments and recommendations do you have for people in this early stage? Richard, let's stay with you on this one.
Well, I guess I would repeat just the value visibility statement. We have postdoc, we have often the case where someone has done a PhD in computational biology, molecular biology, or machine learning, and they could drop into a scientist role at Genentech or a postdoc role. They have to make that decision. And, in the end, there has to, you have to sort of make a lot of assessments about how you value visibility, flexibility, and the extra care that's given to sort of keeping your options open at the end of a postdoc, right? So that's something that, shouldn't be discounted and shouldn't be, scratched off the list. There's a lot of excitement about what's happening in industry right now, but there's still a lot of value in the autonomy and sort of self-direction that you're taught when you do a postdoc with a good mentor. And so I would say that, do consider a postdoc carefully. I mean, for me, that was where I learned a lot of what I'm using now, and made a lot of the connections that led to the opportunities that we needed to launch Prescient. It is hard to jump into those situations. Now, as far as industry versus academia, I think for me, I would say they're focus on the topic and the quality of mentorship, and don't necessarily worry about that division as much. You might do an industry postdoc because you need access to a data set, but you might, if you're interested in regulation and cellular biology, you might find a mentor who's currently engaged in an amazing collaboration or consortium. So think about the data, think about the mentorship, and don't necessarily think about those gross labels that we put on the top, because a postdoc does have a lot of similar, characteristics often between industry and in academia.
I think that's great advice, and I'll echo that. The postdoc for me was just the researcher I was before and the researcher I was after was completely different. And I think my career would have a very different trajectory if I hadn't done that. Others have opinions on this one, Sophia?
Yeah. So at Recursion, we don't have postdocs. We have, all of our data science, machine learning positions are research positions with, as I said, some engineering aspect to it as well. And we definitely publish papers. Actually, we have a poster at MLCB as well this time, and we are really looking for people who are excited about understanding the data, but maybe, as I said, the main motivation needs to be, what we build and how we can improve drug discovery with what we build. But I honestly would say that this, there's a Q&A point about autonomy in industry versus academia as well. And if you are excited about what the company is doing, probably if it's a research position, you will have the chance to work on problems interesting to you, as long as you show the value add for that. So it's not that there's always other people who define problems and you just work on them. It's not necessarily true. So there is definitely an overarching theme of your, company and the data science vision that's provided by the leaders. But there is always chances to work on a problem that's the most interesting one to you. And at Recursion, we have really a spectrum of data scientists who are building the ML platforms and developing the machine learning models, all the way to people who come from bio backgrounds, experienced in data science, and they mostly work on drug programs and do, try to scale up the inferences that are made based on our data, but focused on the biological problem, really. So you can try out different options, even in the same company, and see what excites you the most. There are different options. Even in this panel, experience of Ziv and Richard and myself are different. So really, trying somewhere that excites you is probably the best thing to do, right out of PhD.
Yeah, great. Ziv, do you have advice for aspiring young researchers?
So I hired actually a lot of people over the last several months. Most of them had PhDs, although we hired some master students that were amazing. In terms of where you want to enter master's, PhD, or postdoc, it's much easier, I think, to enter with a PhD. PhD or postdoc, at least in Sanofi, we have a relatively small postdoc, so it's not like in Genentech, but I mean, the main difference would be pay. So you'll be paid a bit more, but other than that, I don't see a huge difference in terms of the hiring. Now, in terms of what you should focus on in your PhD for being attractive to companies, my philosophy is that it doesn't matter. If you do a good job on any computational biology area, my idea is that you will be a good computational biologist, because we are not hiring you for a year or two a postdoc. We are hiring you for a career. Now, obviously, hopefully you'll stay, but if you do stay, then in 3 years, you will move to do something else. So you work today on I don't know, on microarrays. Tomorrow you'll do, I don't know, neural networks for drug discovery. So I am actually much more interested in the education and the research ability of the candidate, rather than on the exact work they did as part of their PhD. If you're doing a good job, it doesn't matter to me. Oh, it's not critical to me. Now, I will say this is true for entry level. If you are being interviewed for a leadership, so if you want to lead a group of 6 people, that's different, because there we are a bit more specialized. But if you're looking for entry, from my point of view, if you did a good job in your PhD, you will do a good job with us on other things.
Yep, I think I agree with that. You want to see success. Although I do enjoy, in the phone screen or an interview, hearing somebody who's willing to think beyond that, who is somewhat familiar with these next few phases at a company, like what you all have discussed well about scale, and being able to think through like, okay, in my PhD work, I solved this problem, but to take it to the next level, I think would involve this. So if you're able to give that some thought, at least, even if it's not part of your project. Okay, there was a question Sophia picked up on that I also noticed, thought was interesting. It was when discussing pros and cons, academia, industry, a common distinction we hear is about autonomy, with the claim that you'd have less autonomy in industry, in academia. What have been your experiences there, Ziv?
I'm not sure, right? I mean, at some stage, sure, but if you join my group in academia, you would have to work on things that are interesting to me. You couldn't work on, when I was in academia, on structure inference, just not with me. You can find someone else if you want, but good luck after 3 years finding. So there is also, I mean, once you start working with an advisor in a specific area, you are pretty much locked to that advisor's area. And also the advisor has his own priority. You are funded by some grant that requires us to deliver something, so you have to work on that grant. So there are constraints in academia. It's not completely free. And as a PI, you're also not free. You have to apply for grants. You have to work on the things that are grants. So there are constraints. In industry, there's maybe more constraints because you are working on a program. But again, at least for me, we have 4 different programs covering very, very different things. So from systems biology to drug design to clinical data. If you want to move between them, you can. I'm not saying every 2 weeks you will move, but there is a lot of, especially in pharma, I don't know about biotech, but in pharma, there's a lot of things you can do. And if you're good, you will be able to move between them, again, at a reasonable length of activity. So I don't see that as a major issue. I think the big difference is what Rich was saying, that the visibility is different. In industry, your visibility for the outside world is lower, and in academia, it's much bigger. But other than that, it's not that different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are great points. Richard?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's enough diversity in industry that, you really have to sort of think through this with each role that you approach, right? I think at a bigger pharma, you most of the time have settings like what we've described. For smaller companies, it's much more common to get locked into this is mission critical, this is mission critical, this is mission critical. And not only do you not have autonomy with respect to what you work on, but you also might not have autonomy with respect to work-life balance or the amount of hours worked and things like that. And so there's a huge amount of variance in companies that are medium and smaller size. And there's also a fair amount of variance in the culture at the big shops as well. So you have to sort of talk to people, you have to do your research, you have to figure out what that balance is. And I think the places where either you don't have a lot of freedom, but it's a really exciting project and they're good mentors, the places that are bigger and there's lots of freedom and everything in between, you have to sort of figure out the reputation for the people you're going to be working with, the teams you're going to be working with, and the culture, whatever the corporate culture is. So yeah, no one size fits all answer for that one.
Yeah, thanks. So Sophia, was there anything else you wanted to add to this, or did you just say what you wanted already?
Yeah, so I wanna add up another point about grants. So as a PI, in order to continue any research in your lab, you have to have grants, and those and you're not necessarily super autonomous because you have to write grantable